In this demo, we'll combine what we've learned up until now to return the points of interest for a city, including the correct status codes. First, let's add a new class. We'll name it Point of Interest DTO and add it to our models folder. We'll give this class an ID, a name, and a description. Then let's extend the City DTO class so it includes a collection of points of interest. If you've worked with collections before, you know it's a good idea to always initialize them to an empty collection instead of leaving them at null, as to avoid null reference issues. We can now also add a calculated field, number of points of interest. This contains the number of points of interest for the city. Now let's add a bit of dummy data to our data store for these points of interest. I'm going to paste that in. So I essentially added 2 points of interest for each city. Now we can add a new controller to look into that extra check we have to make. This time, let's use a built-in template for a change. So we don't choose to add a class, but we choose to add a controller. It's an API controller we want to add, and we're going to write the actions ourselves, so we're okay with the empty controller template. Let's click Add, and let's name it Points of Interest Controller. Using the template made sure that our controller derives from controller base and that it's annotated with the API controller attribute. We also see a route attribute. Let's think about what we want the route template to be. If we want to allow access to the points of interest regardless of the city, a good route template would be something along the lines of API/points of interest. But for our use case, a point of interest doesn't necessarily make sense without a city. It's a resource that's a child of another resource. So I like to reflect this in the URI. In other words, the points of interest of a city should be accessible through API/cities/the city ID/points of interest. Something along these lines. As we remember from a previous demo, a parameter in a template should be surrounded with curly brackets. So let's change some city ID to city ID between curly brackets. When an action now has a city ID in the parameter list, it will be inferred from this part of the template. And then it's time to add an action, get points of interest. We want it to return an action result of a certain type. In this case, the type is an IEnumerable of point of interest DTO, as we want this to return a list of points of interest. Point of interest DTO is defined in cityinfo.api.models, so let's import that namespace. Our action will be named getPointsOfInterest, and we accept a city ID coming from the template. As far as attributes are concerned, the HTTP GET attribute is sufficient. Like that, we signify that this action can be routed to when the HTTP method is GET, and we don't need to input the template because the template as we define it at the level of the controller, so via the route attribute, is sufficient. On to the method implementation. This is where we need to check something else. We just learned in the previous demo that an empty collection shouldn't result in a 404 not found. Because the resource can be found, it's just empty. In this case, however, we should be able to return a 404 not found. More specifically, when the city with passed-in city ID doesn't exist. The reason for that is that in that case, the full URI itself does not map to an actual resource. So we try and find the city with a passed-in ID, and we return not found if it's null. If this does check out, we return an OK passing through the points of interest, which results in a 200 OK status code. Likewise, an extra check should be added for getting one specific point of interest. We add a new action, getPointOfInterest. The HTTP GET attributes template this time contains the ID of the point of interest. We accept that one and the city ID as parameters. The action returns an action result of t, where t is a point of interest DTO. First, we try and find the city. If it doesn't exist, we return a not found. Then we try and find the desired point of interest for that city. If it can't be found, we return a not found. If all checks out, we return an OK, passing through the point of interest. That should be it. Let's give this a try. Let's have a look at the documentation first. We see that two endpoints for point of interest have appeared. We can send a GET request to the points of interest, passing through a city ID, and we can send a GET request to get one specific point of interest, passing through a city ID and a point of interest ID. What we also see when we scroll down is that both the city DTO and the point of interest DTO appear as schemas. Like this, people who are using this documentation can know what to expect. Alright, let's switch to Postman. In our collection, we find a request to get the points of interest for a city. The city with ID 1 exists, so this should result in 2 points of interest being returned. And that is indeed the case with a 200 OK status code. Let's try a city ID that doesn't exist. 5, for example. This should result in a 404 not found, and that is indeed what happens. Then let's try getting a specific point of interest. This example tries to get the point of interest with ID 1 from the city with ID 1. That exists, so it should result in a 200 OK, and indeed it does. Here too, if we change the city ID to one that doesn't exist, we should get a not found, and that is indeed the case. And we should also get a not found if we change the city back to a city that does exist, but the point of interest to one that doesn't. And this too results in a not found. And with that, we've added support for getting child resources, including checks required to return the correct status codes. So when we select the city, we also get back the points of interest. One more thing, let's try getting a city. This has changed. This time around, we're not only getting back the city's simple properties, we're also getting back the points of interest for that city. That's because we coded it like that. Our in-memory data store works with the DTO classes, and those contain points of interest for each city. The consumer of the API at this moment has no say in this. But as you know, later on in this course we will introduce Entity Framework Core. That allows us to easily choose whether or not we want to load child entities from the underlying database, and at that moment we will learn how to let the consumer of the API decide whether or not to return the points of interest when requesting a city resource. We're also still getting back JSON. That's the default format, but that's not always necessarily what you want. With input and output formatters and the principle that's called content negotiation, we can manipulate this. Let's have a look